right, good to see everyone today. If you are streaming with us, welcome. This is session 2 out of our workbook. You will see in the very front of the workbook a guide, kind of a syllabus of sorts, as to what we are going to be discussing in each session. And so when you see that, that is the reading to do before the session and then answer the questions that are there. So we will be in session 2. We'll be talking about a little bit out of the foreword and the introduction and that, but really getting into chapter or book 1, chapters 1 and 2. So let me open with a word of prayer, and then we'll begin our discussion. Father God, we love you and we praise you. We thank you for being God who loves us and who has loved us in such a way to reveal truth to us, and to send your one and only Son to save us. We thank you for the indwelling Spirit as well, that directs us, that convicts us, that wakes us up to your truths. Father, help us to implement the concepts of this into our own faith, and help us to understand what you have done and how we fit into your plan. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. So, how did you find the book? If you have had, how many of you have read any of C.S. Lewis? Okay, yeah, all right, good. Amen. You guys, how are you? So how did you find the reading? If you have read or have not read C.S. Lewis before, how did you find the reading? Okay. Yes. Read, repeat. Read, repeat. Okay, good. Yep. Who else?
I think he tries to make a point several times by restating whatever he's trying to say in a different way.
Yes.
Through the paragraphs.
Right. Yeah, he states
Kind
his
of
point.
pounding
Yes, he is. And one of the reasons for that is, what was this originally?
A radio show.
It was a radio talk. So lecture for the ear is different than lecture for the eye, right? And so that's part of that, absolutely. What else did you find within the reading? What else are just your general thoughts, your general ideas?
Still hadn't decided yet.
Still haven't decided, okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. He sounds British, doesn't he?
Really?
Does he? Yeah.
I finally like reading Shakespeare. And
Yes.
I started reading him fast, like Charles Dickens, and I love Charles Dickens. And then I thought, oh, because he's English, that's why.
Yes.
That's why.
Right. He has a very, in some ways, British way of stating some things. Sometimes word order is not what our word order would be. And who in the world is Jack Robinson? I don't know. And as fast as you can say Jack Robinson, but you have to say it that way with a little bit of an accent. But anyway, very good. So in the before chapter 1, in the preface and forward, what did Lewis say? What was his purpose in writing Mere Christianity? What was his purpose? Why did he write it?
his son and going all the way home in the trenches. All the things he saw, he felt prompted to speak about the problems of suffering and evil.
Okay? So what do we do with suffering, pain, and evil? Okay? And so he began to speak on that. Absolutely. What was his other reasoning behind it?
To defend his belief system.
Yeah, to state beliefs and defend his beliefs, right? Absolutely. What else? What else did he say?
He's not arguing for one denomination, he specifically left out his personal beliefs on things that may separate us, but it was just on basic Christian doctrine, basic Christian hope. There's a God versus not a God.
Absolutely. He is setting aside the things that would divide believers for the purpose of showing. Now, what did he call Britain during this time in the 40s? What did he say Britain is?
Lower church.
Well, he said it is post-Christian, right? So at this time in the 40s, yeah, and so in the 40s, Britain had already moved to a place that the majority of people had moved away from a standard belief within Christian doctrine. And he says, so it is his goal to then show the orthodox belief. By the way, what does orthodox mean? Anyone? So orthodox means, you can kind of say, the main line, the standard of belief, okay? So you can actually have orthodox not just in Christianity or religious talking, but you can have actually orthodox when we talk about math, right? It's that main kind of standard aspect, the true aspect of that, okay? So as he is looking towards this is his goal. What was the metaphor he used about the hallway?
His goal is to get people to come to the hallway, and the doors were different things that they could experience, but the main focus was to get them into the hallway and for them to take a look at different.
Absolutely, Bobby. Yeah. So this idea of coming in the hallway, and it's out of the hallway, there's different beliefs, but his main goal was to get people into the hallway, right? To help them understand that to move as he had, by the way, from outside of the house into this hallway, this aspect of okay, I'm in the hallway of belief in a God and an understanding of who I am in the midst of that. And then from there, there's other things that we can discuss and we might even fight about, and go into different rooms, different bedrooms, the kitchen and all of that, right? And so that was his idea. Okay, so that's his goal. Why then is this and has this been, as I said, I think I have 4, I may have 5 different republished versions of this book. Why, since it was originally published in book form, has it never been out of publish since then? Why is this an important book?
It's basic.
It is basic. Yeah. It helps us to ground ourselves in fundamental belief. Okay? Chuck Colson. We talked about Chuck Colson while he sat in prison. Everybody know who Chuck Colson was? He was the president. He's He was President Nixon's hatchet man. Went to prison over the Watergate deal. Was a devout non-believer. Sitting in prison, so they handed him this book. He actually read it, and then and went to, I guess I should get a Bible and read that too, and became a believer. Okay, and this book, along with God's providence, has moved many people to at least open their hearts and their minds to the possibility. Okay. Now, all of that being said, let's jump into the reading for today. We're going to look at, it's divided into multiple books. We're going to start in book 1, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. Now, if you don't talk, now you may want this, if you don't talk, we're going to be out of here in about 15 minutes. You may be going, that's great, it's hot in here and I'm ready to go, all right? And so the class, unlike the last time, is not going to be me up here preaching and teaching and lecturing. The class really is going to be us sitting together and discussing. I'll facilitate that, and then I will ask some other questions that are not here, but really encourage you. Do the reading, answer the questions. If you don't do the reading, and come to class, but be guarded in the way that you respond to questions, because you may not know what you didn't read. That makes sense. And so, but do the reading. I'll tell you what I do. And I am rereading it with you. I don't know how many times I've read it, but I read with Audible. Okay. A lot of times I listen to it on Audible first. Then I sit down with Audible and the text. And I go and I pause and I reread like Sue was saying. And then I go and I read it without Audible. Okay? And that's just the way my brain works. Okay? So do the heavy lifting of reading. All right? And do the work. All right? Right when a scripture comes to mind as you're reading, write it in the margin of your book. Write it in here. Okay? Take notes in this. And then when you store this book, store your workbook with your book. Okay? All right, so here we go. So C.S. Lewis makes note of a tendency in humans of appealing to a standard of absolute truth in quarrels and arguments. He calls this standard the law of nature or the moral law. So, looking back, have you ever used an appeal to absolute truth in your discussions with others? Notice I didn't say arguments. In your discussion with others.
Yes.
Being a good church of Christ girl, did it in the context of God's word. Word is the truth.
Right.
Didn't open it to a moral law of operating inside of that. Which God placed there. It's almost this is the truth.
Right. Yes. Okay. So Sue says yes, and she directed that towards God's word, his inerrant and infallible. Thank you. If I say it enough, we're going to remember it, right? His inerrant, infallible word, right? That was absolutely true. All right. Who else?
I do the same thing, but like Sue, if somebody doesn't have a biblical worldview, then I don't find any basis for discussing anything. I mean, I could just discuss something with Sue all day long, and we'd have a great time. But if I went out, to somebody that doesn't attend church or whatever, and that's what I think C.S. Lewis is so good with, are non-believers or people on the fence or whatever. But I don't know how to discuss an absolute with them unless they have a biblical worldview,
Okay.
or it's math.
Well,
That is the only absolute I've ever argued.
Very good. Now, here's the irony within math, right? Does math fit into this?
Yes,
Did you like his multiplication metaphor that he uses?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. And that's part of it. So someone else. What about the absolute? Have we already got running?
Well, looking at it from just a basic standpoint, which way I saw it, was when I was growing up with my brother, he was a little bit lazy. I forgive him for it. He had a reason for it, and found out later. But like if I always had to take out the trash, and I said, well, it's your time to take out the trash, because that's only fair because I do it all the time. I'm talking about a standard and don't even realize it.
Absolutely.
There is a standard already set. This is not right that I take the trash out all the time.
Yes. Yeah. And by the way, do you hear what we keep saying? Absolutely. Right?
Mhm.
Absolutely. All right. Yes, that's exactly right. Now, let's set. Now, this sounds crazy for a preacher to say. Okay. Let's set Christianity aside. Okay, and just talk about Ronnie and his brother.
Right.
What was the phrase that you said when you wanted your brother to do it and not always you?
It's
That's
not fair.
It's not fair. Any idea of fairness comes from what?
That standard.
A standard.
Yeah.
Standard that you're normally taught by your parents.
That law of nature that we're going to talk about, I guess you could say.
Yes, there is an aspect of that. So, anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, and I think most of our core values like that as humans come from our upbringing. There were people many years ago who considered someone who was not white to be subhuman, and they were taught that, and that was the standard. We've obviously grown and changed since then, and now hopefully, Lord willing, that's not being taught today.
Yeah,
And there was a core of people knowing that wasn't right, even though they were doing it. And I mean, you can look at Hitler, you can look at Pol Pot, whoever, that there is always just a sense of justice that's wrong, even if people are doing it, supporting it, and it's legal, and there's still a sense that that's the case. And you have to do a lot of things, maniacal leaders use a lot of drugs, use a lot of alcohol, they have to do a lot of things to make themselves okay with mistreating people in a way that the moral law says is wrong.
What does Romans say that we do with the moral law? How do we suppress the moral law? We'll talk, we'll flesh this out a little bit more. We suppress the moral law in our continued unrighteousness. Right? We push it down by we just keep doing more and more, which is unrighteous to do that. So we do something that's unrighteous, the moral law presses on us, and what do? We do something else that's unrighteous to push that down, right? So we silence people, we do whatever, we numb out based on chemicals, or we, whatever. We do something to push down that the moral law is upon us, right?
We use the word unrighteous. Who stands to be unrighteous?
Right.
And 100 years from now, a lot of things that are happening in this world become the standard based upon people's feelings. And that unrighteousness is okay 10, 100 years from now.
Well, there's kind of a difference to me between what's legal, what's accepted, and what's really known. Because there are a lot of things that are legal that are sin, according to God's law. And so what's gonna be taught or what culture would say would be not righteous. But there's still that sense of the moral law. Otherwise, there would never be any law and everything would be total anarchy.
Chaos.
I can punch you, you can steal my stuff. There's not even a word as stealing. That word wouldn't even exist if there would be no prisons. You know what I'm saying? If we didn't think anything was wrong, there'd be no prison, there'd be no policeman, there'd be no law, no nothing anywhere. Now, we may disagree with what the current group is saying legal,
Right.
but there's still, some things are right and some things are wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, Bobby, you want to say something?
I just think that whole first chapter just crushed our current political climate. It's the quintessential answer to the condition of the world that we live in right now about what is truth, what is not a truth, and especially when he used the metaphor of New York, and how that works out in his discussion, just as the clincher on the whole discussion. It's just crazy. It's exactly what you're saying, and what you're saying, you got two different opposed opinions, but there's something that's the third aspect, the scriptural part, the part that is the judge of the two. You know what I'm saying? We both have an image of New York in our mind, but then here's this third aspect, it's the reconciliation of that.
Yes. Yeah, I had an image of New York City in my mind, growing up in South Texas, never hardly been, the furthest I had probably been was maybe to Colorado for skiing or something like that, and so I had images of that. I'd see New York City on, on TV and all of those things, right up until the time I went to New York City, and I had a totally different perspective of what New York City is, the actual place, right? It changed, the truth of what that is, right? And so yeah. Hey Tom. So now, can we actually live as though there is no standard? So, okay, not without consequences. What did you say?
We could, the chaos would come about at some point.
Right.
If there were no stop signs,
Yep. Right. Jay said this a few weeks ago in class or last week or sometime. He said, people who do not believe in a standard, and he said some other things, have nothing to say about the mass shootings in Vermont. There's nothing to say about that. If you do not believe in a fundamental moral standard, a moral law, the natural law, you have nothing to say. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into my family in one quick story, but it's not about me. I get to tell it on my brother because when he preaches, he always tells stories on me. So this is one on him, and this is his dad, Kevin, right? This is he was misbehaving. And I'm going to tell this because it's not horribly misbehaving. So he lives in Long Beach, California. He was on his way to school, and there was a young man who is riding his bicycle to school, and my brother is in his car, and on the back of this young man's shirt, now this is an oxymoron, if you listen, anarchy rules. Okay, anarchy rules. And so my brother is driving along, and this guy is riding his bicycle, I'm sure, and he pulls up next to him. And in our family, there were certain things that we did to each other that we were always about scaring each other. So he drives up next to this young man, and he goes, "Boo!" And the guy on his little bicycle goes, "Ah!" And he goes, "Anarchy rules!" and drives off and goes to school, right? And so here's the deal, right? Of course, the young man in his yelling at my brother and shaking his fist. That young man, anarchy rules. He had no right to get upset at my brother. Anarchy rules. True. Right? But what did that young man whose shirt said anarchy rules, what did he think?
Idiot.
You should have never done that to me, you crazy guy.
Where did that boy say?
Right,
Right.
but anarchy was, right? Does that make sense? And so before we, and this goes to Camille, your comment earlier, before we even, and it sounds weird for a preacher to say, before we even get to this, God has given us standing. Does that make sense? Right? My friend who sat down in a slot seat with a guy, and he said, hey, so what, rules your life? And he said, oh, you mean like a standard, like, like a, whatever? And he said, oh, I don't believe there are any absolutes. And he said, are you absolutely sure about that? Yes. Right? We can't live that way. We may argue about the standards, but in the words of C.S. Lewis, and a little crasser than what we would say probably, no one though ultimately says to heck with the standard. Right?
But doesn't it seem like society today is trying to shift what the standard is? I mean, not necessarily do away with the standard, but eliminate parts of it and create new standards.
Yes, and that is correct. Yes.
But that gives us a place to start, like Camille was saying was, okay, so that's your standard. How did you decide that was right?
Right.
How did you decide that was wrong? And what kind of guides that? And are you the one who decides that? Or does somebody tell you that? I mean, at least it gives us a place to start, is saying we all have a moral law, regardless if we wear anarchy rings.
Why is your standard better than my standard? Right?
Because it's mine.
And so, and that's right. That's kind of where we get to that idea. But there is a standard. And what well, let's go on. Does that make sense? Any thoughts? Any other thoughts on question number one? There is always a standard. Okay. Now I love this part of C.S. Lewis. I love question number two because what he says. Lewis also says that no human appears to be able to keep the law of nature at all times. But if someone feels that they are an exception and should not read the rest of the book. So here's my question. Do you think you're an exception to that statement?
No.
There you go. Absolutely not, right? And even with what we were talking about, people who have changed the standard, even as it has to do with gender stuff, right? So take it out of those arguments and go to, but don't we know how to treat people, right? So are you treating me the same way you want to be treated? Right? Are you giving me honor, the same honor that you're demanding of me? Are you, well, and have you always done that? Well, the answer is no. Right? And so C.S. Lewis already in that question begins the argument for Christianity. Right? He already begins that.
And isn't that what James preaches about when he talks about if a man should come into your assembly wearing fine clothes and then compared to the poor man who comes in? I mean, he's dealing basically, although he's expecting them to have Christian morals, that's just human morals, right? How do we treat one another regardless of who they are?
The aspect of what C.S. Lewis is leaning into here, and ultimately what all of Scripture is again. So what do we do if there's a standard and no one has kept it? Then what do we do? Right? And there's something pressing down upon us. Any other thoughts about chapter 1? Other things that stuck out to you? Good. So chapter 2. Some objections. Some objections. Lewis cites 2 objections to his theory of natural law, which have come to him through letters from readers. Question number 1. By the way, one of the things about C.S. Lewis that is said, you're reading in his biographies, his descriptive, someone who wrote about him said C.S. Lewis was a man of letters. If you sent C.S. Lewis a letter, he would write you back. He received hundreds of letters, probably thousands of letters, right? He was a man of letters and would write back. There's one of my favorites. I used to have a printed copy of it that a person who had written C.S. Lewis, she was a young lady, and she wrote C.S. Lewis, and you can actually find it online. And she said, Dr. Lewis, I am worried about my faith because I'm concerned that I love Aslan more than I love Jesus. And he writes in a very gracious and sweet and loving way that, since Aslan in my books is a personification of Jesus, you are taking the beautiful traits of Aslan, who is the lion in the C.S. Lewis book, not Lady Chronicles of Narnia, and you're taking the traits of Jesus and you're putting it on this character, and so you're not without faith in the one true Jesus. You just got to kind of reconcile that. Anyway, you put it in a much better way, but very gracious. So even this little girl, that writes to C.S. Lewis, he writes back. That just speaks to the kind of person he was. He was far from perfect, but there's some neat things about that. So, 2 objections. 1, the law is from instinct. So why does Lewis think that the moral law is not just a result of human instinct? Yes, sir.
Well, an example, he uses, like somebody's drowning, you are hit with the thought of, I either need to save this guy, or I need to save myself. If I jump in, I'm liable to drown, so I need to think about my own safety. Where your moral law is actually saying, the right thing to do is to try and save this person. So that's where your instincts are could be 2 different ways, where where your moral law tells you, I need to save this person. It's the right thing to do.
Yes. So, in almost every list, okay, what is the greatest fear of mankind?
Death,
Dying.
death and taxes.
Yeah, these are taxes. Yeah, dying. Most, it's usually in the top 1 or 2.
Self-preservation.
Some weird lists, have public speaking above dying, which is hilarious because you would rather be in the casket than speaking of the person in the casket. Okay, you'd rather be dead than speaking about the person. Okay, all right, and spiders creeps up there sometimes. But generally dying. And so what Ronnie is saying, and to C.S. Lewis's point is your greatest fear might be dying, but there's someone drowning, and so you have to weigh that. But then there is something out there that causes you to know what you ought to do, right? Isn't that interesting? All right, who else? Speak to that. Why does Lewis think that the moral law is not just a result of human instinct? What else did you say?
I think he mentioned about animals, they do things by instinct. And that's one big difference between us and animals.
right. Yeah, so we're not simply animals, right? By the way, this is one of my arguments against the theory of evolution, right? I can't buy it, all right? Because we aren't just behaving like animals, okay? Now, there's a lot that we can talk about that, yeah, so there's a difference. What else does Lewis say?
Love can't differentiate between the impulsive thoughts and which are really
Yes, so, what was his example to talk about that? Did y'all hear what Henry said? No, talk a little loud, Henry, say it again, Sorry. I won't say it was good, though. Henry said that he talked about that impulses are really neither good nor bad per se. There's something that does cause them to be good or bad based on what you should do, right? Is that basically what you said, kind of? Yeah, so then, what was one of his metaphors that he talked about?
Mother's love for her children.
Okay, expand on that. Mother's love for children.
That there can be situations that you're in that if you impulsively act on the love for your children, it can be unfair to other children.
Yes. Okay, so a mom's love of children, or a father's love for a child, there are moments in which I wanted to come out of the stands, and sometimes I did, unfortunately. But if you react and your protective nature, right, they call it mama bear, right? That sometimes in the mama bear or the papa bear, right, comes out, and you may be unfair to other children if you simply go based on instinct, right? I'm going to protect my child at all costs, right? At the soccer game or whatever, right? But then what is that? What happens? Well, that means you're going to be unfair to someone else. What else did he say? What about countries?
Patriotism.
At all costs, we're going to cause our nation, which I love our nation, to rise up, okay? And we see this, by the way, in other countries that have warlords, and that they're going to, at all costs. And so what does that cause? Unfairness over there. So the moral law then comes in, and it says no. What should we do? Right? What should we do? Okay? At the same time, now I don't want to, this is not a political statement, I don't want it to be, but it's should we have been in World War II? Now I, for one, say absolutely. Why? But a lot of people died. Should we have done that? Now I wasn't alive during that time, but I think we should have. Why? Because evil was reigning, right? And we are our brother's keeper, right? And so we go in and we find Hitler and we get rid of Hitler, right? Explain the metaphor of the piano that you used.
You say there were two types of notes, wrong notes and right notes, but either note could be wrong or right at any time.
Yeah, he said, yeah, the notes on a piano are
Are the
not
instinct.
wrong or right.
Right.
They're not wrong or right.
They're governed by the third.
Right. So
The
you
law
get,
tells us to change.
the law tells us the tune to play. Chopin or Beethoven or Mozart. Right? They write the correct thing, right? There is a difference between Nora banging on our 110-year-old piano in there, by the way, it desperately needs to be tuned, versus someone who can actually play the piano, right? What is the difference?
Order.
There's order,
Training.
there's training,
There's rules.
there's rules,
Tom said practice
practice, based on what? A piece of
what you
music,
learn.
right?
The music is the thing.
Yes. So that third thing. So here's instinct. All right? Fight or flight. But then that third thing that is above all of it is what should I do? Okay? And you've heard this. Before, I've used it before. I think I attributed it, and I may have missed it in there, but it comes from this concept that as we're driving to church, and you see a 90-year-old woman on the corner of Rockwall, and she's trying to cross the street, but there's too much traffic, and she has 3 bags of groceries, and she's trying to get across the street to get home. We all have 3 options, right? One is we can ignore her and come on to church. Secondly, we can stop and help her get home. Or thirdly, we can veer off of Rockwall and run over her.
Take her out of the whole thing.
There you go. Right? What should we do?
Help her.
Now C.S. Lewis would then say, well, why? Right?
It's the right. It's the right thing.
The right thing to
Right
do.
answer, Camille. Because, right? Because we know, right?
Would we want that kind of help if we were there?
Right, see, we're arguing for a standard,
Right.
right? Now, we can do those other 2, right? We could, right? But we know, right? We can say, well, I was on my way to church and she should have been in church, and I'm gonna, but in our heart of hearts, we get to church and we're going, oh, shit. And Garen preaches on, if your brother's in the way, stop and pick him up, right? And then we have what? Guilt. Oh, I should have, right? There's what I should have done, right? But there's this standard that's out there. Yeah, Bobby?
I just feel like that C.S. Lewis has pleaded the case from the Holy Spirit. That the Spirit convicts, holds the moral standard, and he's doing it in a philosophical way, from a non-religious aspect, that people that live in sin can understand. He uses it very eloquently, in a way that makes it understandable from both as from a Christian perspective.
Without
Still
calling
saying
it
it's
sin.
all.
That's a good point, because that eliminates the option of going to church because I should be in church, because they're not Christian.
Right.
So, and it's not the across the street.
So, and that's where I think, the cohort I was in, it was a discipleship cohort, and it was called the Bonhoeffer Project, and there's a reason for now Dietrich Bonhoeffer that we call it the Bonhoeffer Project and all of that. But we talked about, when does discipleship start? Does it start after Christianity or before Christianity? Right? Discipleship starts, now they don't know it, we do, right? So the Christian knows, right? Discipleship actually begins before one has Christ. Because I'm starting to teach them. Now, they don't know what they're a disciple of, right? They don't know what's happening, right? But there comes a point where as we start teaching, and this that we're talking about comes here. So think about those that are in your life. Now, around here in the South, in the Bible Belt, a lot of people have been a part of churches and are no longer a part of churches, right? But we have to really rip up these conversations to Christian conversations that aren't full of influence. Does that make sense? And so we begin to redisciple and start from ground up, right? Yes, and that, Sue, that is a profound statement.
What'd you say?
We can't
Say
hear
it
back
real loud,
here.
I'm sorry.
Because they know church, but they don't know Christ.
They know church, but they don't know Christ, right? And I think for modernity, as opposed to post-modernity, modernity is not bad. Post-modernity has its issues and all of that, but there is bad and there's good and all of it, right? But modernity said if I do, well, basically it took a math approach, because you're the math teacher, to everything. If I do 1, 2, and 3, I get this product, and so we sought to do product, but we forgot relationship to Jesus, and so we elevated. We generally elevated the worship of the 3 B's, which is budget, buildings, backsides, right? And we forgot that ultimately, what are we doing? We are here to worship and exalt Jesus Christ. Be faithful to Him, right? So, that being said, we have to go back and we have to grab a hold of this idea of relationship. This relationship to God through Jesus Christ. And that we all have a broken relationship in that. Okay.
A great segue though, if you're having this conversation with a non-believer, and then all of a sudden they get it, that there is this higher law, and they need to claim that as of God. And then to think about how we ourselves can't keep that law. Hence, the beauty of the grace of Christ, and Him reaching down to extend that grace to us, and His calling to us to extend that grace to one another, we break that law.
Now, C.S. Lewis is going to deal with this later. Is there anyone who has gone too far that God's grace cannot touch them? No.
Unless they blaspheme the Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
if they
And
continue
what
to
is
do that,
Right?
yeah,
What is that? That's basically saying, God, you're a liar.
yeah.
And you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you talk about, and you can't save me, nor do I want to be saved, and I don't need to be saved,
Yeah.
right? By the way, that was part of the problem with the Pharisees, right?
Yep.
Good enough, I'm a pretty big deal. I have actually kept the moral law. By the way, what does C.S. Lewis say about that? Well, he says you have it, and if you are one of the exceptions, then you need to stop reading my book and go about your, which is hilarious.
Well, and that's the thing I always say, if we can't start with the general belief in the Bible, then we have nothing to talk about. If you don't believe that there is a God and that this is His Word, I'm never going to
Right? And he gives us the words and the ability to think through that, right? That takes scripture out of it, and it still makes sense, right? It still makes sense. All right, let's go to the next objection. Social convention. Lewis dismisses the idea that moral law is a matter of how we are brought up or educated, because so why does he say that the moral law that the moral law is not simply a matter of how we are brought up or educated?
Use the example of the boy on the desert island, that he had nothing, he was not taught anything.
Yep.
So,
And yet,
I don't know if I agree with C.S. Lewis on this point. I think that it's a tremendous, I just think that the things that people, the homes they're brought up in, the situations they're in, their environment, all adds to what makes them what they are. And even some people have gone into countries where there were no churches, no nothing, and people were worshiping, you know, like they should be. And they were, you know, they had moral laws.
Right, and C.S. Lewis would agree with you,
Yeah.
Right.
right? That's what he's saying.
Yeah, I just
though-
don't think that our environment and our education has not influenced people. I just don't think it does. I mean, it doesn't. I think it does.
Well, sure,
Yeah, I
and
think-
he would agree. Right?
Yeah,
He would
I
agree
got
with
the
that,
impression he just
but
really didn't think.
That's not where the moral law ultimately comes from. So what does he say? Why does he push back on this, that, well, it's just all morals, that the moral law is simply social convention? It's from the way you were brought up and the way you're
Well,
educated.
but when you start comparing two people's different the way two people look at it because of where they come from, what they've learned, etc., you start comparing them, you already got a standard that you're comparing them by.
Right? Correct. Yep. What else did he say?
I think by using the boy in the desert island, I think the main point of that is there are some truths, some morals that are innate within us. And so you have to frame it from that viewpoint for people who are not Christians and don't believe in the Bible. For us, we know where our morals came from. But for people of the world who maybe have never even heard of God, yet they still have those very basic moral principles, you have to start somewhere and then expand on that. And so this is a way of starting, because that's who he was talking to.
Right.
He was talking to people who were not Christians. He was talking to a post-Christian society. So he's starting where they're coming from, that they do have these absolute rules. Okay, we all have these absolute rules. Here's our common ground, and building from there.
I love the fact that when Amy Sullivan explained to Helen Keller who Jesus was, Helen Keller just went, I know him. I've known him for all my life. I read that part.
You know, think about, and let's take a religion that teaches people to hate and teaches people to kill people who are not in your particular religion. So, you know, and Father takes him out and says, now, son, it will be your duty to kill all the people in this city or whatever because they are wrong. I mean, even though their social convention is he's been taught to hate and he's been taught to kill, it's based on a right and a wrong. Because they believe those people out there who I'm teaching you to hate and kill are wrong and we're right. So there's still a place to start. So even though his social convention has been all against God's standards, it's still that that people group, that religion has a moral law. There's somebody who's right and somebody who's wrong. Now, we would disagree with them about what God would say about who they're saying is right and wrong. But they're gonna go kill those people because they're wrong.
Absolutely.
Or am I even saying that one people's morality is better than theirs?
Yeah.
Um,
I think also, we have a brain. You said something a while ago about animal instinct and evolution and such. And, you know, animals even have feelings towards other, you know, even though, yes, they have brains and they have the instinct part of that, but that's not, you are taught some of those things.
Why did Cain turn out differently from Adam?
Abel.
You know,
Yeah, Abel.
Self-preservation, I mean, you thought that,
but it's
It's
a real hard
sin
thing.
entered the world through Adam's fall.
Yeah.
And so what did he do, right? He went against the standard, right?
Right.
That's what he did. I mean, and God said, and sin is crouching at the door, waiting to have you, right?
Now that's a
To
problem.
have-
Evil.
And so.
And he knew it was wrong.
Yeah.
Chose wrong.
It wasn't that he didn't understand
Now,
the
here's what's
rules.
interesting about Cain. when the standard giver came and said, this is what's going to happen, what did Cain do?
Wanted protection.
He argued against the standard, right?
That's not fair.
He said, I've already broken the standard, but when he said, okay, you broke my standard, here's what's going to happen. God, it's too hard for me. And so God said, okay, in a moment in a guy that did not deserve grace, what did God do? I'm going to put a mark on you of grace. And I'm going to send you off. Yeah, you're going to be a wanderer, but no one's going to kill you. Right? Anyway, so yeah. All right, now, so, whew, all right, so let's jump down a little bit to nearly the end of chapter 2. What was Lewis's metaphor or his example of the person who comes up and talks about the Salem witch trials? 100 years ago, we were burning witches at the stake. So what did Lewis say about that? And I thought this was fantastic. All right? I'll just throw my cards out on the table. I love this, so don't talk bad about it. So what did he say about that?
We don't believe in witches, so why would there be a trial?
Yeah, we don't believe in witches, but if we did believe in witches, what should we be doing? Fighting against the witches. If we did believe in witches who were killing people with their minds and with their spells, who were indwelt by Satan, and they were doing horrible, terrible things to people and communities, what should we do?
Burn
We should burn them. Right? We should put them to death, right? Because they're doing horrible, terrible things, but we don't believe in witches. And that's why, and that I think is the beauty of this. And then what is his last line?
I like that.
I love his last line in chapter 2. What does he say?
You would not call,
Go ahead.
you would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mouse traps if he did so because he believed there were no mice in the house. That's pretty cool.
That's a great statement, right? So if I, why would I run around and set a bunch of mouse traps if I don't think I have mice? Right? I'm creating something that doesn't actually exist, and so why would I do that? By the way, that's also a danger if we always look at something and say, well, let's find the catch-22, right? Or, let me play the devil's advocate, okay? No, I don't want to let you play the devil's advocate, right? Let's just look at reality. Let's look at where we live and then work from there. Does that make sense? And go, okay, let's look at what I've actually experienced, okay? And then go from there and then unpack that. Does that make sense? So general thoughts on all of that. General thoughts on the first reading.
I like the fact that he said that because we say someone is Christian, doesn't necessarily mean that he's a Christian. He's either a bad Christian or he's not one.
Yeah.
Just because he's good, that doesn't make him a Christian.
Yes, that's right. At our local bank, one Christmas Eve or one Christmas deal, I was talking to a guy about his Christian belief, and he said, well, as long as I do all the right things and make sure that I'm right with the man upstairs. And I said, that's great, but what makes you right? Well, being a good guy. And that's your emphasis. Well, is that what saves us? How many times do you have to go to church to get yourself saved?
Just one more.
Yeah, just one time. I mean, how many times, do you not tell a lie? And then what do you do if you do tell a lie? To fix the lie, how do you fix it? Right? How do you, so what happens, and that's why I keep coming back, in the Bible Belt, what we have to come to realize is what God has done on our behalf. Not what I'm doing for to get myself saved. Does that make sense? That C.S. Lewis, not only for the non-Christian, but for preacher Aaron, is screaming out. He's screaming out from the grave. Aaron, there is a moral law you have not changed. Right? There is a moral law you have not changed. So now what? Right? So now what I do? And that's what we're going to do next week. Okay? So we begin to lean into this and test the word of C.S. Lewis. Any other final thoughts? Questions? Just keep reading. It's hard, that's okay. Just keep reading. Just keep reading. All right, love you guys. Blessings.
So did you